Who's there?
Sarah.
You stay back!
The following story contains elements of suspense, supernatural occurrences, and psychological horror. It is intended for an audience that enjoys a good scare. Viewer discretion is advised. The sun was dipping low over the Chesapeake Bay, casting long, skeletal shadows across the marshlands of rural Maryland. It was that specific time of evening when the sky turns the color of a bruised plum, and the air grows heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth. Caleb and Maya pulled their salt-crusted SUV into the overgrown driveway of the Steele estate. For months, they had searched for a way out of the city, a place where they could breathe, and they had found it here, nestled between weeping willows and the silence of the woods. The house was a sprawling colonial beauty, built of deep red Maryland brick that had weathered 3 centuries of Atlantic storms. It stood like a silent sentinel, its windows reflecting the dying light like cataracts on an old man's eyes. Most people would have seen a ruin, the sagging porch, the ivy choking the chimney, but Caleb saw a masterpiece. More importantly, he saw the price tag. They had bought the massive estate for less than the cost of a 1-bedroom apartment in Baltimore. "It's our fresh start," he whispered, squeezing Maya's hand. She smiled, though her eyes lingered on the dark tree-line. As they began to unload the first of their boxes, the silence of the Maryland countryside felt absolute. There were no sirens here, no shouting neighbors, just the occasional cry of a heron and the rustle of the tall grass. But as the last of the light vanished, replaced by a thick, silver moon, the atmosphere began to shift. The house didn't feel empty. It felt like a lung that had been holding its breath for a very long time, and now, finally, it was starting to exhale. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of beeswax and ancient dust. They set up a temporary sleeping area in the grand foyer, not yet ready to tackle the dark hallways upstairs. Caleb made a fire in the hearth, the orange flames dancing against the high ceilings. For a few hours, it was perfect. They shared a simple meal, laughed about their haunted mansion, and planned the renovations. They felt like the luckiest people in the state. But as the fire died down to glowing embers, the house began to wake up. It started as a vibration, a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate in the soles of their feet. Caleb brushed it off as the old plumbing settling or perhaps a distant truck on the highway. But then came the sound. It wasn't the creak of floorboards or the scuttle of mice. It was a soft, rhythmic friction, like sandpaper being rubbed against velvet. It was coming from the walls. Maya sat up, her blanket pulled tight to her chin. "Caleb, do you hear that?" she whispered. Caleb nodded, his eyes fixed on the shadows near the ceiling. The sound grew more distinct. It was sibilant, full of S sounds and soft T breaths. It sounded like a dozen voices, all speaking at once, kept at a volume just below human comprehension. It was a collective murmur, a sea of hushed conversations happening behind the plaster and the brick. Caleb stood up and walked to the nearest wall, placing his ear against the cold surface. His heart hammered against his ribs. Usually, the walls of a house are a barrier between you and the world, a symbol of safety. But as he listened, he realized these walls were not empty. He could hear the rise and fall of sentences, the cadence of pleading, and the sharp hiss of a command. It was as if the very history of the house had been stirred into the mortar. "It's probably just the wind in the chimney," Caleb said, though his voice lacked conviction. He tapped on the wall, and the whispering stopped instantly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was an expectant silence, as if the house were waiting for him to speak back. He waited for several minutes, his breath hitching, but the sound did not return. They eventually fell into a fitful sleep, But Maya's dreams were filled with images of people trapped in narrow spaces, their mouths moving but no sound coming out. She woke up just before dawn, the gray light of a Maryland morning filtering through the dusty panes. The house felt different in the light, less predatory, but still heavy. On the floor, near the wall where Caleb had heard the voices, a small pile of fine, white plaster dust had gathered, as if something inside had been scratching to get out. As they drank their coffee on the porch, looking out at the mist-covered creek, Caleb tried to stay positive. He spoke of new paint and structural repairs. But Maya couldn't stop thinking about the sound. She realized that the house hadn't been cheap because of its age or its location. It had been cheap because it was occupied by something that didn't show up on a deed. The first lesson of their new life was beginning to settle in. A bargain is rarely just about money. Sometimes, when you buy a house, you are also buying the secrets that were meant to be buried with the people who lived there before you. They had moved to the country for peace and quiet, but as the mist began to lift, Maya realized that quiet was the one thing this house would never provide. As the day began, the whispers remained dormant, but the air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Caleb grabbed a crowbar to start investigating the source of the noise, his face set in a mask of determination. But as he touched the tool to the wall, a single clear word echoed through the room, not from the wind, but from the very wood beneath his hand. It was a name, and it wasn't his. The morning sun over the Maryland marshes brought a deceptive sense of security. The golden light spilled through the tall windows of the Steele estate, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. To any outsider looking in, it was a picture-perfect scene of a young couple starting their fixer-upper dream. But for Maya, the sunlight felt thin, like a veil stretched over a bruised face. The word Caleb had heard, or thought he had heard, hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy. It was a name that sounded like thorn, a sharp, prickly syllable that didn't belong in their new life. Determined to shake off the night's terrors, Caleb decided they should focus on the master bedroom. It was a grand room on the second floor with a view of the creek, but it was currently draped in layers of peeling, yellowed floral wallpaper that looked like wilting skin. "If we make one room feel like home," Caleb said, brandishing a scraper and a spray bottle of vinegar water, "the rest of the house won't feel so intimidating. It's just an old building, Maya. Old buildings make noise. We just need to give it some love." Maya wanted to believe him. She grabbed a sponge and started on the opposite wall. For the first hour, the work was therapeutic. The rhythmic sh-huck of the scrapers filled the room, and the smell of damp paper replaced the stagnant scent of the night before. They talked about where the bed would go and how they would refinish the mahogany floors. But as the afternoon heat began to rise, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew thick and humid, and the light seemed to take on a sickly, jaundiced hue. Maya was working on a stubborn patch near the corner of the room when a large sheet of wallpaper finally gave way. It didn't tear. It sloughed off in one giant piece, revealing the original plaster beneath. She froze. Instead of the smooth, white surface she expected, the wall was covered in dense, frantic charcoal markings. They weren't doodles or graffiti. They were symbols, interlocking circles, jagged lines that looked like lightning bolts, and tiny, cramped script that seemed to crawl across the masonry like ants. "Caleb, look at this," she whispered. Her voice sounded small in the high-ceilinged room. Caleb walked over, his forehead beaded with sweat. He wiped his hands on his jeans and squinted at the wall. The charcoal was deep and dark, as if the person who drew it had pressed down with a desperate, trembling force. As they traced the lines, they realized it wasn't just random art. It looked like a schematic, a map of the house itself, but with extra lines and rooms that didn't exist in the physical world they were standing in. The whispers began again, though much fainter than the night before. It wasn't a sound in the ears so much as a vibration in the teeth. Maya felt a sudden, sharp chill, despite the Maryland humidity. She reached out to touch one of the symbols, a small eye-shaped mark near the depiction of the fireplace. As her finger neared the charcoal, the temperature dropped so rapidly her breath hitched in a silver plume. "This isn't decoration," she said, her voice trembling. "This looks like a warning. Or a seal." Caleb, ever the skeptic, tried to laugh it off. "Maybe the previous owners had a kid with a very dark imagination," he suggested. But he didn't move any closer to the wall. He noticed that the charcoal lines seemed to lead toward the floorboards, disappearing into the gaps. The more they looked at the map, the more it seemed the house was built around a secret that the wallpaper was meant to hide. The moral weight of the house began to press on them, the idea that they were intruders in a story they hadn't bothered to read. Feeling a sudden need for answers, they left the house and drove into the nearby town of St. Jude's Landing. It was a small, coastal village where everyone seemed to move at the speed of the tide. They found the local library, a tiny brick building overflowing with maritime records and colonial genealogies. Behind the desk sat Mrs. Gable, a woman whose skin looked like fine parchment and whose eyes held the sharp intelligence of a hawk. When Caleb mentioned they had bought the Steele estate, the entire room seemed to go silent. The two other patrons, old men in flannel shirts, immediately lowered their newspapers. "The Steele place?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice a low rasp. She didn't offer a welcome to the neighborhood. Instead, she stood up and walked to a restricted section of the stacks, returning with a heavy, leather-bound ledger. "That house wasn't built for living, Mr. Thorne." "Oh, excuse me, Mr. Crawford. It was built for keeping." Judge Sterling, the man who laid those bricks, was a man of particular habits. He believed that if you spoke a sin into a brick while the mortar was wet, the sin would stay trapped there forever, leaving your soul clean for the Lord. Maya felt a bead of cold sweat roll down her spine. "A map. We found a map behind the wallpaper," she told the librarian. Mrs. Gable's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened on the ledger. "That's not a map of the house, dear. That's a map of the debts." The judge was a lender, a seeker of secrets, and a man who never let a grudge go cold. "Those symbols you saw? Those are bound whispers. If you're peeling back the paper, you're peeling back the skin. You're letting the secrets breathe again." They drove back to the house in a heavy silence. The sun was setting again, and the shadows of the willows looked like long, reaching fingers. As they pulled into the driveway, the house looked different. It didn't look like a bargain anymore. It looked like a debt collector waiting on the porch. Caleb tried to stay brave, reminding Maya that folklore was just stories meant to scare tourists. But as they stepped back inside the foyer, the air was vibrating. The whispers weren't just in the walls anymore. They were coming from the floorboards, the ceiling, and the very air around them. They were clearer now, no longer a murmur but a discordant choir of voices. Some were crying, some were laughing, and one, a deep, booming voice that sounded like a gavel hitting wood, was reciting a list of dates. Maya looked at the wall where they had stripped the paper. The charcoal symbols seemed to be glowing with a faint, oily light. They realized then that by improving the house, they had inadvertently broken a seal. The past wasn't just a memory in Blackwood Creek. It was a living, breathing entity that had been muffled by layers of time and paper. As they stood in the dark, the whispers grew into a crescendo, and for the first time, Caleb heard the words clearly. "The interest is due." The house seemed to groan. "The interest is due." Caleb grabbed Maya's hand, his knuckles white. He realized that they had been so focused on what they could get from the house, a cheap price, a beautiful view, that they had ignored the responsibility of what they were taking on. Respecting the foundations of the past wasn't just a suggestion. It was a requirement for survival. And as the first floorboard in the kitchen began to creak upward, pushed by something from below, they realized the house was about to start collecting. The third morning at the Steele estate did not arrive with the cheerful song of birds or the gentle rustle of Maryland pines. Instead, it arrived with a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on Caleb and Maya's chests. The fog outside was so thick it swallowed the driveway and the creek, leaving the house floating in a gray, formless void. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only them and the red brick echoes of Judge Sterling's secrets. Caleb woke up with a deep, hacking cough, his skin pale and clammy, though he insisted he was just reacting to the old dust. They migrated to the kitchen, the one room they felt was modern enough to offer some comfort. It was a spacious area with a heavy oak table and a large walk-in pantry. But as Maya went to boil water for tea, she stepped into a pocket of air that made her heart skip a beat. In the far corner of the kitchen, near the basement door, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. It wasn't the chill of an old house. It was the biting, aggressive cold of a meat locker. She could see her breath blooming in thick, white plumes, and when she reached out her hand, it felt like she was touching a wall of ice. "Caleb, come here," she said, her voice shaking. Caleb walked over, his face etched with exhaustion. As he entered the invisible boundary of the cold spot, he winced. On the counter within that freezing zone, a glass of water he had left out overnight had frozen solid, the ice cracking the glass from the inside out. But it wasn't just the cold that was terrifying. It was the sound. In this specific corner, the whispers weren't a collective murmur anymore. They were focused. They were sharp. They were calling a single name over and over again. Lydia. The name was spoken with a mixture of grief and absolute, bone-deep malice. Caleb tried to ignore it, grabbing a space heater from the hallway and plugging it in. "It's just an air pocket, Maya. Probably a gap in the foundation letting in the dampness from the creek. I'll patch it up this afternoon." He began to talk loudly about his plans for the garden, about the types of vegetables they would plant in the spring, his voice rising in an attempt to drown out the name echoing in the corner. He spoke over the house, refusing to acknowledge the reality of the cold. But the house would not be silenced. As Caleb spoke, the space heater began to hum violently. The orange coils glowed with an unnatural, blue intensity before the device suddenly sparked and died, the smell of scorched plastic filling the air. The cold spot seemed to expand, creeping across the floorboards like an invisible ink. Maya watched in horror as a thin layer of frost began to form on the kitchen table, tracing the wood grain in patterns that looked suspiciously like the charcoal symbols they had found behind the wallpaper. "Caleb, stop talking and just listen," Maya pleaded. She realized that every time Caleb tried to rationalize the events, the manifestations became more aggressive. The house wasn't just haunted. It was demanding an audience. It was a courtroom, and the judge was still presiding. She sat down at the table, right at the edge of the frost, and closed her eyes. She forced herself to breathe slowly, ignoring the instinct to run. She stopped projecting her own fears and began to truly listen to the cadence of the whispers. Behind the name Lydia, she began to hear other sounds. The scratching of a pen on parchment, the heavy thud of a boot, and the sound of someone sobbing behind a closed door. The cold spot wasn't just a temperature change. It was a memory bleeding through the layers of time. She realized the whispers weren't just random spirits. They were a record. The judge had used these walls to store the testimonies of people he had wronged, and Lydia was the most prominent among them. Caleb, seeing Maya's stillness, finally went quiet. He slumped into a chair, his bravado finally breaking. In the sudden silence, the kitchen felt different. The aggression of the cold seemed to soften into a melancholy chill. A single floorboard in the corner, right where the cold was most intense, began to groan. It wasn't the sound of wood settling. It was the sound of something shifting underneath. Caleb, now moving with a grim sense of purpose, grabbed a pry bar. He didn't speak a word as he wedged the tool into the gap. As the board popped up with a sharp crack, a gust of stale, metallic air escaped from the darkness below. Nestled in the dirt beneath the floorboards was a small, rusted tin box, wrapped in a rotted piece of blue silk. Maya reached in and pulled it out. The metal was so cold it burned her fingertips. Inside, They found a single silver locket and a folded piece of paper. The ink faded but legible. It was a confession, signed by a woman named Lydia, admitting to a crime she clearly didn't commit. A confession forced out of her by the judge in exchange for her family's safety. The moment Maya touched the locket, the whispers in the kitchen stopped completely. The temperature in the corner began to rise, returning to the humid Maryland morning. But the silence that followed wasn't a peaceful one. It was the silence of a secret that had finally been touched. They had found the evidence of the judge's corruption, a buried debt that had been literal rather than metaphorical. Caleb looked at the locket, then at the wall where the charcoal map waited upstairs. "We shouldn't have opened this, should we?" Caleb whispered, his voice now low and respectful. He realized his mistake. He had spent the last 2 days trying to fix the house's appearance while ignoring its soul. He had been so busy talking that he hadn't heard the warning. The moral lesson of Blackwood Creek was becoming clear. Truth is a guest that will eventually force its way into the light, whether you are ready to host it or not. As they sat in the now quiet kitchen, the sun finally broke through the fog outside. But as the light hit the silver locket in Maya's hand, it didn't sparkle. Instead, it cast a shadow on the table that looked like a pair of hands reaching out. From the basement door, just behind them, came a soft, distinct sound. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was the sound of a heavy door being unbolted from the other side. The house had accepted their discovery, but it wasn't finished. It had shown them a victim, but now it was preparing to show them the judge. The gavel man was no longer just a name in a library book. He was a presence that was moving toward them through the dark arteries of the estate. The silver locket sat on the kitchen table, a cold, tarnished weight that seemed to pull the very light out of the room. Outside, the Maryland fog had begun to retreat, but it left behind a world that felt stripped of its color. Caleb and Maya sat in silence, staring at the confession of a woman named Lydia. A woman who had been dead for over a century, but whose fear was still palpable in every jagged stroke of her pen. The sound from the basement door, the heavy clack thud of a bolt being thrown, echoed in their minds like a heartbeat. The house was no longer just a building they were renovating. It was a living record of a man who had built his empire on the broken spirits of others. Caleb reached out to touch the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. As a man who valued logic and hard work, the idea of cursed history was difficult to swallow, but the evidence was literal. He looked at the basement door, which now stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of impenetrable darkness. The air coming from the gap smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like old coins. "He was a judge," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. But he wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in collection. They spent the next few hours in the living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes that now felt like the belongings of a temporary guest. Maya had brought the leather-bound ledger she had secretly borrowed from Mrs. Gable at the library. As she flipped through the yellowed pages, the legend of the gavel man began to take shape. Judge Sterling hadn't just been a local official. He had been the Shadow King of Blackwood Creek. He would find families in debt, or young men caught in minor legal trouble, and offer them a settlement. He would take their land, their heirlooms, or their silence, and in exchange the charges would vanish. The most terrifying part of the legend was how he recorded these deals. The local lore suggested that Sterling believed a secret held in the mind could be leaked, but a secret held in the stone was eternal. He had built the steel estate using laborers who owed him their lives, and it was said he forced them to recite their darkest shames into the very mortar as they laid the bricks. Every wall in the house was a repository for a different tragedy. The whispers they heard at night weren't just ghosts. They were the echoes of the gavel man's ledger, a chorus of people who had traded their integrity for a moment of peace, only to find that the judge never truly let a debt go. As the afternoon sun began to wane, the house seemed to grow physically heavier. The shadows in the corners of the rooms didn't just lengthen. They deepened, becoming thick and velvety. Suddenly, a sound erupted from the floorboards directly beneath Caleb's feet. Boom! It was a sharp, wooden strike, the unmistakable sound of a heavy gavel hitting a desk. The house shook with the force of it. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the windows rattled in their frames. Maya screamed, clutching the ledger to her chest. Boom! The second strike came from the hallway. Boom! The third from the ceiling. It was a rhythmic, judicial pulse that seemed to be sentencing them for their presence. Caleb stood up, grabbing a flashlight, his face set in a grim expression of defiance. "He thinks he can still intimidate people," Caleb said, though his eyes were wide with terror. "He thinks this is still his courtroom. But he's dead, Maya. He's just a memory trapped in the walls." But as Caleb spoke, the whispers returned, louder than ever before. This time they weren't just murmuring names. They were reciting the settlement. Maya heard a voice, thin and wavering, saying, "I give my name for the sake of the farm." Another voice, deeper and filled with rage, hissed, "I give my truth for the sake of the boy." The moral weight of the house was crushing. Every beautiful brick, every grand staircase, had been paid for with a piece of someone's soul. The judge's legacy wasn't the house. It was the corruption he had harvested to build it. Caleb realized that his own desire for a cheap house was a mirror of the judge's greed. He had wanted something for nothing, ignoring the obvious signs that the price was too low. Integrity, he realized, was the only legacy that truly lasted. The judge had died wealthy and powerful, but he was trapped in a red brick prison of his own making, surrounded by the voices of those he had cheated. Caleb looked at Maya and saw the same realization in her eyes. They weren't just dealing with a haunting. They were witnessing the aftermath of a life lived without a moral compass. The gavel strikes stopped as suddenly as they had begun. In the ensuing silence, a cold wind blew through the house, despite all the windows being closed. The basement door, which had been cracked open, now swung wide with a slow, inviting creak. From the darkness below, a light began to glow, a dim, sickly green luminescence that pulsed in time with a low, wet-breathing sound. It was coming from the very foundation of the house, the place where the heaviest debts were kept. Maya stood up, her hand reaching for Caleb's. "We have to go down there," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The locket we found, it's just one piece. The whispers won't stop until the record is cleared. We have to see what he's hiding in the roots of this place." Caleb looked at the dark maw of the basement stairs. He thought about the gavel man waiting in the dark, still holding his phantom court, still waiting for the next person to sign away their peace. As they took their first step toward the basement, the whispers turned into a low, mournful song. It was a song of longing and lost things. They realized that the house wasn't just scary. It was profoundly sad. It was a monument to the things people give up when they are afraid. As they descended the wooden stairs, the wood groaning under their weight, Caleb felt a strange sense of clarity. They were no longer just victims of a scary legend. They were the only ones who could finally adjourn the judge's court. But as the flashlight beam hit the bottom of the stairs, it revealed something that wasn't in the blueprints. A small, wooden door, reinforced with iron bands, sat nestled behind the water heater. It was the hidden parlor mentioned in the charcoal map upstairs. And from behind that door they didn't hear whispers. They heard the sound of a pen scratching frantically on paper, as if someone were still trying to balance the books. The air in the basement was different from the rest of the house. Upstairs, the air felt old, But down here it felt stagnant, as if the oxygen had been trapped since the day the foundation was poured. Caleb's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating thick cobwebs that draped like funeral veils from the low ceiling beams. They stood before the iron-banded door Maya had spotted. It was small, barely 5 feet tall, and tucked away in a corner where the brickwork shifted from the neat red of the upper floors to a rougher, darker stone. This was the room that shouldn't exist, the one missing from the official blueprints but sketched in frantic charcoal behind their bedroom wallpaper. Caleb reached out, his hand hovering over the iron latch. The scratching sound from within had stopped the moment his boot hit the bottom step. Now, there was only the sound of their own jagged breathing and the distant, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the shadows. "Maybe we should stop," Maya whispered, her hand gripping the strap of her bag so hard her knuckles were white. "The librarian warned us. The map warned us. Some things aren't lost. They're hidden for a reason. But curiosity is a persistent ghost, and the need to know the truth of their home was stronger than the instinct to flee." Caleb pressed his weight against the door. It didn't budge at first, held fast by a century of rust and perhaps something less material. He groaned, putting his shoulder into the wood. With a scream of complaining metal, the door swung inward. A cloud of fine, gray dust erupted, stinging their eyes and coating their tongues with the taste of ancient lime. As the dust settled, Caleb swept the light across the room. It wasn't a cellar or a storage unit. It was a parlor, perfectly preserved, fully furnished, and utterly suffocating. The room was circular, lined from floor to ceiling with dark mahogany bookshelves. In the center sat a heavy clawfoot desk, its surface cluttered with stacks of parchment, inkwells, and a single ornate gavel made of black stone. The walls weren't brick here. They were covered in a deep crimson velvet that seemed to absorb the light of the flashlight. But the most unsettling detail was the temperature. While the kitchen corner had been freezing, this room was uncomfortably warm, humming with a low, vibrant heat that felt like the fever of a sick animal. Maya stepped inside, her eyes drawn to the desk. The scratching sound they had heard wasn't coming from a person, but from a pen that lay on a half-finished document. As she watched, the quill tip twitched, leaving a tiny blot of fresh, wet ink on the page. She realized then that the hidden parlor was the heart of the house's mechanical cruelty. This was where Judge Sterling had finalized his settlements. On the shelves weren't books, but thousands of small glass jars, each containing a scrap of paper or a personal trinket, a lock of hair, a wedding ring, a child's marble. Each jar was a debt, a piece of someone's life held in escrow. Caleb began to pull jars from the shelves, his face pale. "He didn't just take their money, Maya. Look at the labels." He held up a jar. The faded ink read, "Arthur Miller, 10 Years of Peace." Another read, "Grace Van Dorn, The Memory of Her Mother's Face." The judge had been a collector of the intangible. He had traded legal favors for the very things that make a person whole. The moral horror of the discovery began to sink in. They weren't standing in a house, but in a spiritual pawn shop where the interest was paid in human suffering. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a force that shook the stone floor. The temperature in the room spiked, the heat becoming almost unbearable. The red velvet walls began to ripple, and the whispers returned, not as a murmur, but as a deafening roar of overlapping voices. They weren't pleading anymore. They were accusing. The jars on the shelves began to rattle, their glass clinking together in a discordant chime. In the center of the room, the black stone gavel rose an inch off the desk and struck the wood. Boom! The sound felt like it struck them in their very souls. Maya fell to her knees, covering her ears. "We have to leave. Caleb, we shouldn't have opened this," she screamed. She realized the moral lesson they had ignored. Curiosity, when untethered from wisdom, can lead to a prison of one's own making. By entering this room, they had stepped into the judge's private chambers, and in his court, there was no such thing as an innocent bystander. They had become part of the record. Caleb scrambled for the door, but there was no handle on the inside. The wood felt like solid iron. He turned back to the desk, seeing the quill pen moving frantically now, writing their names at the bottom of a fresh sheet of parchment. Caleb and Maya Crawford. The ink bled into the paper. Payment. The Steele estate. The house wasn't theirs. They were being drafted into the collection. The judge was attempting to add them to the jars on the shelves, to trade their future for the bargain they thought they had found. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, Caleb grabbed the black stone gavel and threw it against the mahogany bookshelves. The glass jars shattered, and as they did, a whirlwind of white light and cold air erupted from the broken vessels. The heat in the room was sucked out in a sudden, violent vacuum. The screams of the debts being released tore through the space, and the pressure on the door vanished. Caleb grabbed Maya and shoved her through the opening just as the red velvet on the walls began to dissolve into black soot. They collapsed on the cold dirt of the outer basement, gasping for air that didn't taste like ink and dust. The iron-banded door remained open, but the room inside was now dark and silent. The hidden parlor had been exposed, but the victory felt hollow. They had learned that some doors are meant to stay closed because what lies behind them cannot be handled by the living. They had interfered with a century of carefully managed misery, and the house, the physical body of the judge's greed, was already beginning to react to the loss of its collection. As they sat in the dark, Maya noticed something glinting in the dirt near Caleb's foot. It was a single gold coin, larger and heavier than any she had ever seen. It hadn't been there before. She picked it up, and as her skin touched the metal, she felt a wave of intense, oily greed wash over her. It was a beautiful thing, a payment for their trouble. But as she looked back at the basement door, she saw a flicker of the green light again. The house wasn't letting them go. It was trying a different tactic. It was no longer using fear. It was using the very thing that had corrupted the judge in the first place. The morning following the discovery of the hidden parlor brought a strange, suffocating heat to Blackwood Creek. The Maryland humidity was thick enough to taste, but inside the Steele estate the air felt different. It felt expensive. The gold coin Maya had found in the dirt sat on the mahogany dining table, catching the morning light in a way that seemed to defy physics. It didn't just reflect the sun. It seemed to pull the light into itself, glowing with a deep, honeyed warmth that made the rest of the room look gray and lifeless. Caleb couldn't stop looking at it. Every time he passed the table, his hand would instinctively reach out to feel the heavy, ridged edge of the metal. By noon, the atmosphere of fear that had dominated the house for days had shifted into something far more insidious. Obsession. Caleb, who only a day ago was ready to flee, now spent his hours pacing the hallways with a hammer and a stethoscope. He wasn't looking for ghosts anymore. He was looking for hollow spaces. "Think about it, Maya," he said, his voice breathless and high. The judge didn't just collect secrets. He was a lender. He was a hoarder. If there's one coin in the foundation, there are thousands. This house isn't a haunt. It's a vault. Maya watched him with a growing sense of dread. She felt the weight of the coin too, but to her it felt like a leaden anchor. Every time she looked at the gold, she remembered the labels on the jars in the basement. 10 years of peace. The memory of a mother's face. She realized that the gold wasn't just currency. It was the physical manifestation of everything the judge had stolen. It was ill-gotten in the most literal sense. But as she watched Caleb pry a loose floorboard in the parlor, she saw the house beginning to change. The walls were no longer just static brick and mortar. They were beginning to pulse. It was subtle at first, a rhythmic, slow expansion and contraction of the plaster, like the breathing of a giant in deep sleep. When Maya pressed her palm against the wallpaper, she didn't feel the cold of stone. She felt a faint, thumping vibration, like a heartbeat buried deep behind the lath and plaster. The house was reacting to Caleb's greed. It was as if the building were a predator that had finally found the right bait. The more Caleb talked about the fortune hidden in the walls, the more the house seemed to come alive, the whispers turning into a low, satisfied purr. In the late afternoon, Caleb let out a triumphant shout from the library. Maya ran to him and found him standing amidst a pile of shattered brick. He had smashed through a section of the chimney breast, and there, spilling out like a golden wound, was a stream of coins, jewelry, and silver plates. It was a king's ransom, hidden in the very marrow of the house. But as the treasure hit the floor, the house let out a low, structural groan. The pulsing in the walls grew more violent, and the temperature in the room spiked. The smell of ozone and ancient copper filled the air. "We're rich, Maya. We don't ever have to work again." Caleb laughed, his eyes wide and glazed. He began to stuff his pockets with the heavy coins, his movements frantic. But Maya saw what he didn't. She saw that as Caleb took the gold, the shadows in the room were beginning to detach themselves from the floor. They weren't just dark spots. They were silhouettes of the people from the jars, the debtors. They stood in the corners of the library, silent and hollow-eyed, watching Caleb claim the wealth that had been harvested from their lives. The moral weight of the moment was staggering. Maya realized that greed wasn't just a desire for more. It was a heavy burden that blinded a person to the cost of their soul. "Caleb, put it back," she begged, her voice cracking. "This isn't ours. This is the weight of everyone the judge stepped on. If we take this, we become part of the debt. We become the next jars on the shelf." But Caleb was beyond listening. He was enchanted by the glitter, his fingers stained black by the ancient soot and the dirty gold. The house began to manifest its true nature. The floorboards beneath Caleb's feet started to soften, turning from solid wood into something that felt like sinking sand. The walls groaned as the cracks in the plaster widened, revealing not just more gold, but a network of dark, vein-like roots that seemed to be pumping the liquid heat through the estate. The house wasn't just a building. It was a parasite that fed on the avarice of its inhabitants. The judge hadn't died and left the house. He had become the house, and now he was looking for a new heart to keep the blood pumping. By sunset, the sky over Maryland turned a violent, bruised red, signaling an approaching storm from the bay. Inside, the weight of gold had become literal. Caleb was so laden with coins in his pockets and arms that he could barely stand, yet he refused to let a single one go. He staggered through the library, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every time he moved, the house pulsed in unison with his heartbeat. The shadows of the debtors moved closer, their silent presence a reminder that in the gavel man's court, nothing is ever truly free. Maya realized that they were at a turning point. The house had shifted from scaring them away to trying to keep them forever. It had used their own human weaknesses against them. As the first crack of thunder rolled across the Chesapeake, the walls of the library split open, and a torrent of gold coins began to pour from the ceiling like a metallic rain. It was beautiful, terrifying, and suffocating. Caleb was being buried in the very thing he craved, his laughter turning into a muffled plea as the weight began to crush the breath from his lungs. The lesson was clear. Greed is a heavy burden to carry, and sometimes the things we want most are the things that will eventually bury us. Maya grabbed a heavy iron fire poker and began to smash the windows, desperate to let in the cold, honest air of the coming storm. She had to break the spell of the gold before the house finished its settlement. But as the wind began to howl through the broken glass, she saw a figure standing in the rain outside. A man in a tall hat, holding a stone gavel, waiting for the storm to break the house wide open. The storm that rolled in from the Chesapeake Bay was unlike any Maryland had seen in a generation. It wasn't just a weather pattern. It felt like a celestial judgment. The sky turned a bruised, electric purple, and the wind began to howl with a pitch that sounded like a million voices screaming in unison. At the Steele estate, the ancient weeping willows lashed against the brick walls like scourges, and the rain didn't fall. It hammered. Inside, the atmosphere had reached a breaking point. The gavel man was no longer a shadow in the corner. He was the storm itself, and he was coming to collect. Caleb was still pinned in the library, his legs buried beneath the heap of gold and silver that had poured from the chimney. The light of Maya's flashlight flickered as the house's electrical system finally surrendered to the gale. In the sudden darkness, the pulsing of the walls became a strobe light of rhythmic, sickly green energy. Every time the house breathed, the cracks in the plaster widened. Maya scrambled over the debris, her hands scratched and bleeding from prying at the heavy coins. "Caleb, you have to let it go. It's not treasure, it's a trap," she screamed over the roar of the wind. But Caleb's fingers were locked around a silver chalice, his knuckles white. The greed had gone deeper than his mind. It had seeped into his bones. He looked at her, and for a second, his eyes weren't his own. They were hard and cold, like the glass of the jars in the basement. "It's our future, Maya," he wheezed, the weight of the gold pressing the air from his lungs. It was then that the first major crack appeared in the ceiling. It didn't just break. It unzipped. A long, jagged fissure ran from the library door to the window, and from that gap, the house began to speak. This wasn't the hushed whispering of the first night. This was a cacophony of testimonies. The house was literally vomiting the secrets it had been forced to hold for 300 years. Voices of farmers, widows, and broken men poured from the ceiling in a torrent of sound. "He took my land for a lie," one voice shrieked. "He let my son hang to save $1, another wailed. The air became thick with the scent of old sorrow and wet earth. The plaster fell in heavy, wet chunks, and beneath the white surface, the lath would look like the ribs of a giant, rotting animal. The figure Maya had seen in the rain, the man in the tall hat, was no longer outside. The front door of the estate, heavy oak reinforced with iron, didn't just open, it disintegrated. The gavel man stepped into the foyer, his footsteps echoing like the strike of a hammer on an anvil. He was a tall, gaunt specter, his face a mask of dried parchment, his eyes two hollow pits of infinite debt. He carried the black stone gavel from the hidden parlor, and with every step he took, the house groaned in submission. He wasn't a ghost seeking peace. He was a collector seeking his final settlement. Maya realized that the truth the house was screaming was the only weapon they had. The gavel man's power came from the silence he had imposed on his victims. As long as the secrets were hidden, he was the master. But now, with the walls cracking open, the truth was escaping. She stood up, her legs shaking, and faced the doorway of the library. She saw the specter approaching, the green light from the walls casting a long, terrifying shadow behind him. "We know what you did," she shouted, her voice cracking but firm. "We found the locket. We found Lydia's confession." The specter paused. The temperature in the room dropped so low that the rain pouring through the cracks turned to ice midair. The gavel man raised his stone gavel, his jaw unhinging as if to speak, but only the sound of grinding stone came out. Maya turned back to Caleb, grabbing him by the shoulders. Caleb, look at him. That's what happens when you hold on to things that don't belong to you. You become the weight. You become the debt. She forced his head toward the doorway, making him look at the monstrosity that greed had created. For a heartbeat, the spell broke. Caleb saw the gavel man, not as a figure of power, but as a pathetic, hollow thing, enslaved by the very riches he had stolen. The gold in Caleb's hands suddenly felt hot, like coals from a furnace. With a cry of disgust, he opened his hands. The chalice and the coins fell away, and as they did, the weight on his legs seemed to vanish. He scrambled out from the pile, his face streaked with tears and soot. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I'm so sorry." The moral lesson of Blackwood Creek was manifesting in their very survival. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to face the truth, no matter how much it costs you. By rejecting the gold, they had rejected the judge's world. But the gavel man was not so easily dismissed. He struck the floor with his gavel. Boom! The library floor split in two, a yawning chasm of darkness opening between the couple and the exit. The house was beginning to collapse into the hidden parlor below, the foundation itself giving way under the weight of the storm and the released spirits. Maya and Caleb clung to the edge of the tilting floor as the wind tore through the room, scattering the gold like autumn leaves. The specter moved toward the edge of the chasm, his hand reaching out. He didn't want the gold anymore, he wanted the people. He wanted two new voices to fill the silence of his walls. The house was screaming, the storm was raging, and the very bricks were turning to dust. "Jump!" Caleb shouted, pointing to a small ledge that led toward the back stairs. It was a leap of faith into the dark, with no guarantee that the stairs were still there. Behind them, the gavel man let out a sound like a mountain crumbling, his form blurring into a cloud of black ink and white bone. They had faced the truth, but now they had to survive the consequences of the house's final, violent death rattle. As they leaped across the dark void, the last thing Maya saw was the silver locket she had tucked into her pocket. It was glowing with a soft, blue light, the only light in a world that had gone completely dark. The leap across the chasm felt like falling through time itself. For a heartbeat, Caleb and Maya were weightless, suspended between the crumbling greed of the library and the uncertain safety of the back hallway. They slammed into the narrow ledge of the servants' stairs just as the library floor gave way completely. A thunderous roar filled the air as 3 centuries of stolen wealth, mahogany furniture, and cursed brick plunged into the dark maw of the basement. The dust that billowed up was thick and tasted of salt and old ink. They lay there for a moment, gasping, as the house continued to scream around them. The gavel man was not gone. From the depths of the hole, a sickly green light began to pulse, illuminating the swirling dust. The specter rose from the wreckage, his form now massive and distorted, woven together from the shadows of the very debts he had collected. He didn't walk. He drifted upward, his black stone gavel raised high. The house was no longer a structure. It was his body, and he was pulling the walls inward to crush the interlopers who had dared to disturb his ledger. The record must be closed, a voice groaned, sounding like the grinding of heavy stones. Maya scrambled to her feet, pulling Caleb up with her. They retreated toward the back door, but the hallway was changing. The walls were no longer plaster. They were becoming transparent, revealing thousands of glass jars embedded in the wood, each glowing with the trapped spirits of the judge's victims. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, a deafening wall of sound that made Maya's ears bleed. She reached into her pocket and felt the silver locket. It was vibrating with a cold, rhythmic pulse. She realized then that they couldn't just run. The judge wouldn't let them go because they were the only living witnesses to his crimes. "Caleb, the locket!" Maya shouted over the roar of the collapsing house. "It's not just a souvenir. It's the one debt he couldn't finalize. Lydia never gave in. She remembered the confession they had found, the woman who had admitted to a crime to save her family, but had kept her heart and this locket as a secret anchor. The gavel man reached the top of the stairs, his shadow stretching out like a dark tide. He swung the stone gavel, and the wall beside them shattered into a million splinters. Maya didn't run this time. She stepped forward, holding the silver locket high. "Judge Sterling!" she cried out, her voice ringing with a strange, ancestral authority. "The court is adjourned. Your ledger is empty." She threw the locket into the center of the dark mass that formed the gavel man's chest. For a second, everything went silent. The locket didn't hit him. It was absorbed, sinking into the ink-black shadow. A blinding flash of pure, white light erupted from the specter's heart. The locket acted like a catalyst, a single drop of pure truth in a sea of lies. The spirits trapped in the walls, the voices from the jars, suddenly changed their tune. They weren't whispering in fear anymore. They were shouting in triumph. The green light of the house was replaced by a brilliant, scorching radiance. The gavel man let out a final, soul-shattering cry as his form began to unravel, the shadows of the debtors he had enslaved finally pulling him down into the very earth he had tried to own. The ground shook with the force of an earthquake. Caleb grabbed Maya, and together they threw themselves through the back door and onto the rain-soaked grass of the lawn. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the woods, turning back just in time to see the steel estate reach its final settlement. The great red brick house didn't just fall. It imploded. The walls folded in on themselves, the roof collapsed into the basement, and with one final, echoing boom of a spectral gavel, the mansion vanished into a pile of rubble and dust. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. The clouds parted, revealing a pale, silver moon that turned the Maryland mist into a ghostly veil. The silence that followed was absolute. No whispers, no groans, no heartbeat in the ground. For the first time since they had arrived, Blackwood Creek was truly quiet. Caleb and Maya sat on the damp earth, shivering and exhausted, watching the dust settle over the ruins of their bargain. As the sun began to rise over the Chesapeake Bay, casting a gentle, golden light over the landscape, they looked at the wreckage. There was no gold to be seen, no silver chalices, no mahogany grandeur, just broken bricks and splintered wood. Everything they had bought with their savings was gone. But as Caleb looked at Maya, he didn't see loss. He saw the color returning to her face, and he felt the lightness in his own chest. The heavy, oily grip of greed had been washed away by the rain. The moral lesson of the whispering bricks was etched into the very soil they stood upon. Peace of mind is worth more than a mansion of gold. They had come to Maryland looking for a cheap path to a dream, but they had learned that the most expensive things in life are often the ones that cost you your soul. Integrity and truth were the only foundations that could withstand a storm. They had lost their house, but they had saved themselves, and in the world of folk tales, that is the greatest fortune of all. A few hours later, a local sheriff's deputy found them walking along the coastal road. He looked at the smoking ruins of the estate and shook his head. "Tough luck," he said, offering them some water. "That old place was always trouble. Nobody ever stayed there more than a week. You're lucky to be alive." Caleb nodded, holding Maya's hand tightly. "We're more than lucky," he said softly. "We're free." They left Maryland that afternoon, leaving the bricks of Blackwood Creek to be swallowed by the marshes. The legend of the Gavel Man would remain, a story told by locals to warn travelers about the dangers of a too-good deal. But for Caleb and Maya, the story was over. As they drove away, Maya looked into the rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw a young woman in a blue silk dress standing on the edge of the ruins, waving a silent goodbye. Maya smiled and turned her eyes back to the road ahead, where the sun was shining on a new, honest beginning. The land at Blackwood Creek remains empty to this day. They say that on very quiet nights, When the mist is thick, you can still hear a soft sound coming from the ground. It's not a whisper and it's not a scream. It's the sound of a pen, finally resting, and the silence of a debt that has at last been paid in full. True wealth is not measured by the size of one's house or the gold in one's walls, but by the peace within one's heart and the honesty of one's life. Greed is a debt that only grows, while the truth is a gift that sets you free.